Hello, and welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith. I'm the Ryan half of Ryan and Brian, and this is episode number 46 and our fifth episode of season 2. This week, Brian and I are talking about the story in the Gospels of Jesus entering the temple, flipping the table of the money changers, and driving all the animals from the temple. In a lot of our Bibles, the editors have labeled this story, Jesus Cleanses the Temple. I've called it Jesus Cleansing the Temple several times on the podcast, and Brian has alluded that he doesn't like to call it that. So in this episode, I'm asking Brian why he doesn't refer to that story as Jesus Cleansing the Temple and what he thinks the story might actually be about. It's a great conversation. Before we get started, just a quick reminder that you can find us at thebiblebistro.com, on Instagram and Facebook at The Bible Bistro, and on YouTube at Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. We have also set up a Patreon account, so if you're enjoying the podcast and would like to support our continued work, you can do that. You can find a link for that in the show notes, but also by going to the website, thebiblebistro.com, and clicking on the link at the top. All right, let's jump right in. Hey, Brian, welcome back to the Bistro.
Hey, Ryan, good to see you today.
It's good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's a
Good.
It's a good day. We've had some snow last week, but it's a nice day out there actually today. So
It is a nice day, except our road, we're like in the city and we're in a cul-de-sac and it's horrible.
Right.
Like as soon as you get out of the cul-de-sac, you're
Yeah,
fine. But
so
once you get in there, it's a mess.
we lived for a long time in on a dead end road, as they call a cul-de-sac, and it was interesting. The city would take
Yes.
care of the first, the main roads, and then they would do the secondary roads, and then if they had time left, they'd get around to us.
Oh, are we going to do something for them this year? I don't know. Nah, they'll be fine. They can figure it out.
They didn't give us a Christmas present last year, so.
Yes. So we've had the big snowstorm.
Yeah.
We've been out playing in the snow. Our kids have been
Yep.
frolicking, getting ear infections, all the things that
Oh,
kids
nice.
do at this time of
Yeah.
year. Yes.
We had, had some neat episodes we've laid down. Got some neat ones coming up. Some really,
Some real neat ones.
really neat.
Beaver.
I've got
Beaver to beaver.
I've got my sweater
that's
on.
neat.
I got my sweater on today for those who are listening and can't see. So
I put on my podcast shoes before we started, my slippers. Like Mr. Rogers.
Oh, I see.
Come on.
I do
that's
that.
a deep cut for you.
Yeah, I don't know if you're. Well, that's a long story. I don't know if you remember when I at my office at Lincoln, I would always have a pair of slippers there that I would change into from class.
Did you have a card?
So, sometimes I would forget, and I'd go to class in my slippers if it was in the same building. But anyway,
Oh, goodness. Yes. Well, we're back. We're making it happen. We've had fun
Yeah.
episodes,
Yeah.
some neat ones.
Yeah.
We've got some more neat ones, some fun guests
we have
coming
some
up.
interesting guests coming up. Some a repeat guest, I will say, and a new guest. So yeah, very very cool.
Yeah, we're gonna keep it coming. But today we are going to tackle the question
yeah.
that's been plaguing me for a year.
Well, and I want to know, what is it that bothers you? What's going on with this? What's this whole thing? Tell me what this question
Brian,
is that's been plaguing you.
This all started when I was 8 years old. Anyway, no, laying on the couch. So we've been doing this for a while, and you know a lot about the Book of John. We've talked about John a couple days, more than me by a slight margin.
Okay.
Anyway, and we have talked through it. We've read a book on it, all this good stuff.
Right.
And during these conversations, at some point we get to John chapter 2.
Yeah.
And I say something that apparently is deeply offensive to you.
Now, see, I think you're exaggerating this slightly. I think that this
Well,
this
okay.
is not the way I understand it. But what do you normally say? How does this conversation usually go?
We usually get to this section
John
where
2.
John 2. It's the second part of
Okay.
John 2. I would say the middle section.
Yeah, starting verse
okay.
13 or so. Yeah.
Verse 13, and it a passage that in my Bible, and I have always said, and I've heard it said many times, is it's Jesus cleansing the temple. And you always, I say it, and then you're like, well, that's, and then it's like, and Jesus, in John 2, when Jesus cleanses the temple, you're like, well, that's not what I say.
Well,
and it's almost like this passing.
What I usually say is I don't call it that, and there's a reason for that, and you're wanting to know. So what's bothering you is you want to know why when you say cleansing the temple, I respond to that.
Yes.
Where-
Well, I've said it many times,
Okay.
and we've had that response. And in true Brian Johnson fashion, you said, "We'll talk about that
another time."
We'll talk about that another time." Well, now is the time.
Okay,
There's
well,
no
let's
future
talk
time
about
than now.
what's going on with that and trying to.
So Jesus cleanses the temple. No, sorry. The story of Jesus in the temple, flipping, doing some stuff with tables.
So what I usually call this is the temple incident, and we'll get to that, and I'll try to explain what my visceral reaction is to when you call it the cleansing of the temple, why that happens. And actually, I think this will be good for our listeners for a couple of reasons. I think they'll enjoy it for a couple of reasons, Ryan. One is I think the information's interesting to me, and it fits in with what we've talked about other times. That I think the temple theme in the Gospel of John is one of the central themes. I mean, that's not going to be a surprise to anybody who's been around me for very long or heard me talk about the Gospel of John, that the temple, and particularly presenting Jesus as the fulfilling the role that the temple had is a pretty important part of what John is up to, I think. So I think that'll be interesting. But then the other part of this is I thought this will be a good opportunity to explain kind of why interpretively what we have going on, and even the way we use our Bibles and this kind of thing. Because where does it say the cleansing of the temple in your Bible?
So it says it in the section break. It's not part of the verse or anything like that.
It's a header. And that's the
Mhm.
thing I wanted to get across. And it's just something to think about. We'll talk about this a little bit more further down in this episode, not next time or later. But
now.
But you have to be careful when you pick up your Bibles. There are different things we talk about. We've talked about translations before, but the other thing is there are what we often will call additions or versions in that sense. But these are editorial decisions that are made by people that have to do with how the verses are laid out on the page. So, for example, some Bibles have 2 columns per page. I don't know if you've noticed this. Some have 1 column per page. We've talked a little bit about chapters and verses before and how those were not in the original. The footnotes and those kind of all the way that those things are put in there are editorial decisions. And one of the things that's good to think about is where do those come from? So, when John wrote the Gospel of John, he didn't stop at verse 12 of John chapter 2 and then say, okay, now I'm going to talk about the temple incident, I'll say. And he starts in verse 13.
Say it.
It was all written together, and then those are editorial decisions. Now, well, and I want to hold off for just a minute. So let's talk about just this account, this thing in general. I know we have talked about this in other places. The first question that I think you have to approach, and I know we've talked about this in a different episode, I think you have to ask the question is, did this, and this is talking about in the life of Jesus, did this occur one time in his ministry or 2? Because it's interesting when you compare the Gospel of John to the other 3 Gospels. We call them, synoptics. We've talked about the difference between John and the synoptics. One of the differences that we've noted is that this account of Jesus in the temple is very early in the Gospel of John, whereas in the synoptic Gospels, it occurs in what we call the final week.
It's kind of an event that really leads up to his arrest and crucifixion.
It really is kind of the final, thing that kind of gets
the ball
people
rolling.
upset. Now, there are some things about this, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you, and this makes some people mad, and that's fine. People are mad at me.
Would be the first time.
Yeah, people have been mad at me before. I can handle it, but I don't think there's any reason to get super upset about this. But I think that historically the event happened once, and so it was. I think John, in placing the story where he does, is making a point. He's making a point about this, and like I've said, the temple theme is central for him, and so I think moving this. Now, there's a couple things I'll say, and these are not. I've shown a little bit of this at times. These are, again, partly the way I interpret the Gospel of John. But I think John is primarily writing for people who already know the broad outlines of the story of the life of Jesus. So he's not writing for people that have never heard this story before. Luke, on the other hand, I think is writing for people that this is a new story perhaps for them, or they've only recently become believers in Jesus. John, on the other hand, I think is writing for people who are familiar with the outline. A couple of examples. What's that? Go ahead.
Yeah. So would it be like a Jewish Christian audience,
I think a Jewish audience, and I think I think his look at what he says is his primary purpose. This is in John chapter 20. I know you've already got John 2 queued up there, but John chapter 20, verses 30 through 31, the very end of chapter 20. And actually, here's another example. This is usually set off from the text ahead of it in your editions. Is there a break between 29 and 30?
And the header says the purpose of this book.
Okay, which I think that's correct. But I don't think it's good to separate this from the Thomas account. I think this is the capstone of the Thomas account. We'll talk about that maybe another time.
Cha-ching! I mean, we should make a bingo game for our listeners.
But this is an example. This is an example of that again, where the header we have to be careful of, right? Now here's what it says in this NIV, 2011 NIV. Jesus performed many other signs. The word semai, signs, is very important in the Gospel of John. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples. We've talked about testimony and how it's very important for John that these things were done with witnesses. He did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may believe, and here's the two things. D.A. Carson says it this way, and I think he's right, that the Messiah is Jesus, that the Christ is Jesus. In other words, this Messiah that you're looking for is none other than Jesus of Nazareth, and the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So it seems like at least the author's stated purpose, and I have no reason to doubt that he knew what he was writing this for, is to, the fancy way we'd say this is to engender belief, right? It's to engender faith. He's writing for people in order to bring them into faith, and particularly what he wants them to believe is that the Messiah is Jesus. Now, for me, that seems like a Jewish purpose, right? A Jewish audience.
Right.
I've mentioned before that until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, most scholars in the modern period of the Gospel of John, most of them, not all of them, most of them thought that he was writing with a Hellenistic background. But after the
that is like a Greek background.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Greek background. I should have said it that way. But after the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, John A.T. Robinson wrote to me, one of the biggest articles ever on the Gospel of John, and he said that the Dead Sea Scrolls show us, and basically that there's a kind of Jewish dualism that we find there, show us that the background of the Gospel of John is much closer to the events that he's portraying, that it should be understood as a Jewish background. So you take those things together. If he says, I'm writing this so that you will believe that the Messiah is Jesus, and we see all kinds of ways that he uses I've mentioned the Jewish feast before, Jewish practices like cleansing is very central to what Jesus is doing. Now, I was thinking about this earlier because you were talking about the cleansing of the temple. Right. Cleansing is, the Gospel of John is full of cleansing. But just not here. So I'll give you
all the places to miss it.
I'll give you a couple of examples. John chapter 1, that it talks about that the disciples of John the Baptist are, of course, he's never called the Baptist in the Gospel of John, but they come criticizing Jesus' disciples about, and it says they had an argument about washings, about how cleansing took place. What's the first half of John 2? If the last half is the temple incident, what's the first half?
That's the wedding at Cana.
Wedding at Cana, and you'll know centrally featured in that are 6 stone water jars, which John tells us, or the narrator technically tells us, are used for
ceremonial
cleansing of the Jews. John chapter 14, you've got Jesus washing the feet of the disciples, or is it 13? 13, John chapter 13. Jesus washing the feet of the disciples, cleansing, washing the feet of the disciples. And, Peter, of course, says, you're not going to do this for me. And he says, if I don't wash you, you have no part with me. And then Peter says, of course, well, then give me a bath, my head, my hands, wash me all over. And Jesus says, the one who is already clean need to do this. Two of the pools that Jesus sends people to, the pool of Siloam and the pool of Bethzatha, both seem to be pools that were used for ceremonial cleansing. I believe are what's called mikvaot, that are used for ceremonial cleansing before the people would enter the temple. So, it's full of cleansing.
There's a lot of cleansing, but it is not.
Well, and I'll tell you what.
But it's not in the whole point of this podcast.
We'll get there. So
right.
John is telling us that the reason that he's writing is for this purpose. Now, the other thing I've mentioned before, that the way I approach the interpretation, particularly the Gospels, is narratively. Narrative criticism, technically, although narrative criticism can mean a lot of different things, so I want to be careful. That technically there are things that I don't do that narrative criticism do, but I try to look at the Gospel of John as a story and understand why John made the choices he did, because you saw that in chapter 20, verse 30. I could have written all kinds of things, John says, but I've written these.
Right. There was intention in the way that he wrote
choice these. in the accounts that he chose to give us. Now, I would also argue along with that there's also placement, that he chose to place this where he does. So I'm gonna show you something narratively you may never have noticed in the Gospel of John that helps me think that this account is the same as the one that take place. Now, there's other reasons I think this is the case, but one of them is just narratively, that this account of the temple incident early in the Gospel of John is the same one that takes place in the synoptics in the final week. One thing I always point out just to begin with is if you're going to argue that there was one temple incident at the beginning of Jesus' ministry and one at the end, you have to also explain why John chose not to tell us about the one that takes place at the end. All four Gospels tell us about one incident. John only tells us about this one, if there are two.
Right.
But there's lots of ways that this is connected. And John even, I think, gives us hints that this is connected to in the same way that synoptics tell us that this is leading up to Jesus' death. The Gospel of John, the author tells us this is connected to his death as well. But let me show you something. This is an example of narrative criticism or narrative interpretation, I'm going to call it. I don't like the word narrative criticism, but narrative interpretation. Look back. I want to show you some what are called narrative markers.
Okay.
So authors will often give us a hint that they're getting ready to tell us a new story or a new account. And John's favorite narrative marker is what's called a temporal marker. There's different ways to mark the beginning of an account. When I think about narrative interpretation, we usually do this with movies and TV shows. We are a visual culture, and we've become most of us are pretty good if we watched enough movies or television, and most of us have. I know I've watched more than enough television. We are pretty good at reading the visual cues that are given to us. I mean, that's what you do for a living, right? And you understand that there are certain shots that will speak in a certain way. You're communicating in the video shots that you choose to take when you're doing a video, right? That's what you do for a living. And if our listeners don't understand that, so these temporal markers, when you start to see them, become very obvious. There are different kinds of markers that can be used. I was going to use the example. That's where I was going with this. Forrest Gump, for example, he has a marker throughout that movie when he's done telling a story. And of course, the other interesting thing, keep Forrest Gump in mind because we'll come back to it. Most movies today don't bore us by telling the story from beginning to end. Right? They understand we're sophisticated viewers and we want to be interested. So most of the shows today we usually use terms like flashbacks and flash forwards. So Forrest Gump, if you'll think about it, the narrative time of the movie itself is only a little bit of time. He goes and sits down on a park bench and starts telling a story, but then those vignettes or those different accounts in his life are flashbacks, right? He's going back and he's telling, and then he'll come forward. And typically, what's his narrative marker? What am I going to say? He usually,
Mama said, "What? No, what? Go." I don't know what you're saying.
He usually says, and that's all I have to say about that.
Got to say about that, right?
end of scene, right? Or it's time for the next story. So here's what the narrative markers are that I want you to notice. Look at verse 29 is the first one I want you to notice. John chapter 1. John chapter 1, verse 29. Go ahead and just read these for us.
Yeah. The next day he saw Jesus coming toward him and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God."
So this is talking about John the Baptist. But do you see that how that verse begins? The next day.
The very next day.
Right. So that's now look at verse 35.
The next day. Oh my gosh.
See it?
Again, John. Yeah, I saw it. That's why I read it with emphasis.
Look at verse 43.
Oh boy. I know where this is going. The next day,
okay,
Jesus decided.
And so you see he's basically saying this happened, and then the next day this happened, and the next day that happened. Now look at chapter 2, verse 1.
On the third day.
Okay, and third day, by the way, is an Aramaic or Hebrew idiom that means the day after tomorrow. A lot of people talk about the third day. This is going to raise some other questions I don't want to get into right now. But the third day means, so this is the first day, tomorrow's the second day, and the day after tomorrow would be the third day. So on the third day, day after tomorrow is the way we would say it. That's our idiom, but the Aramaic idiom is on the third day. And so you see what's happening is John is giving us these different accounts that are, and they all have to do with really the early life of the disciples and the gathering of the disciples. That's what's going on here to this point. Now, I've given you every temporal marker to this point. I want you to notice what verse 13 says then. This is the beginning of the temple incident.
The Passover of the Jews was at hand.
Okay. Now, isn't that interesting? The next day, the third day, it was almost time for Passover. Okay.
Like there's a leap of time here.
And so here's the thing I would say is there are some people who say, well, this has to be the next. In fact, they build these elaborate structures sometimes about what's going on with these first accounts in the Gospel of John. And I think John is very intentional about this. I think he's saying it was time for the Jewish Passover. Moreover, I think we're thinking about the last Passover in the life of Jesus, which is going to cause some other problems for us later down the road as well that we have to think about. But it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. I think I've told you this before, but in the Synoptic Gospels, it's interesting that all of them, if we only had the Synoptic Gospels, we only know about Jesus going up to the Passover.
We only know 1 year of his life.
And in fact, Luke is very interesting. About halfway through the Gospel of Luke, it says Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem, and the rest of the Gospel of Luke is basically him marching toward Jerusalem. And so it's this idea that the Passover, Jesus going up to Jerusalem. And we'll come back and I'll talk about some of these things later on. So here's my whole point. My whole point is, I don't think, even though John tells us a story here at this point in his gospel, I don't think he's trying to say that this happened very early in Jesus' ministry. Secondly, there is an example. Now, I talked about flash forwards and flashbacks. When you're talking about a written narrative, we always like to use fancy terms, right? It makes us feel like we're talking about something meaningful. We use the term prolepsis and analepsis. Prolepsis, instead of a flash forward, a proleptic statement means something that is looking toward the future. Okay. And then an analeptic statement would be what we call a flashback, right? It's something that's back before this time. So whenever we're looking at a narrative, we talk about what's called narrative time. So there's this time that the story is being told, that the account is being given. Okay, that's the timeline of that. Now, we all understand when we're talking about a book that is not the equivalent to the author's timeline.
Right.
The author is writing at a later period of time. Okay. So there's that. And often what we'll talk about when we're talking about the books of the New Testament, we'll talk about the historical setting, right? When is this book being written? Now, I told you I have a little bit of a different view of that than some people, and I'll say something more about that in just a moment. But I want you to notice John 2:22 right now. Read that. That's just in the middle of this incident. Read just verse 22 for me.
When Therefore, he was raised from the dead. His disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken.
Now, this is one of the reasons I don't think John's writing for somebody who is just hearing the story for the first time, because, man, he just gave away the ending, right? What does it say there?
After when he was raised
raised from the dead.
So you know he died and he's back again.
And it's not he's just saying this as a matter of fact. It's not like, some kind of big revelation, some big reveal. This is a proleptic statement. And so he's taking us then to some other timeline, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is stepping out of narrative time. And in fact, this is an example in video. We would call this breaking the fourth wall, right? And
right.
The narrator, and I think the narrator and the author are the same people. We could talk about this another time if you want. But when we're thinking about the meaning of this account, when the narrator's breaking in here, he's basically speaking to the reader. And he's saying, not at this time. Jesus said this kind of stuff. And we're going to see what he said here in just a minute. But at a later period of time, after his resurrection, we understood these things. So the author's talking about a time that's neither the time of the writing nor the time of the narrative. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes. Yes.
So part of thinking about the way narratives work, about the way that telling a story works, is thinking about these timelines. So what is happening? The author's telling us the story about what took place at the temple this day, whatever day that was. But then suddenly he flashes forward to a time after Jesus' death. Now, The interesting thing is he's connecting this incident with the death and resurrection of Jesus, the same way the synoptics do. Now, this isn't the only place he does it. If you look back up in verses 16 and 17, Jesus does what he's doing. He quotes this, to those who sold doves, he says, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house." We've talked about my Father's house a lot already in the Gospel of John. One of the few times in the New Testament that phrase occurs. "Stop turning my Father's house into a market." Verse 17, his disciples remembered that it is written. And here there's different opinion on when they remember this. Are they remembering this at the time, or is this, like John says, after his resurrection? His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Now, what does that seem to be a reference to? The idea of zeal for your house will consume me. What does that seem to refer to?
Take his life.
I think consume here. Now, I think this is an example of what John uses, the author uses frequently, which is an intentional ambiguity. So the idea of consuming means I was filled up with zeal for your house, but also as the disciples see the response of the Jewish leaders to what Jesus is doing, they're going, zeal for his house is going to kill him. It's going to be the result. It's going to result in his death. The same thing that the synoptics tell us, that this is connected to the death of Jesus. Now, that's, I would say, historically, the reason that I think there's only one incident like this in the temple is it's very hard to imagine getting away with it more than once.
They're the second time they've been like, "Oh, here he comes again."
So this is from the historian Josephus. They tell it. So you might have heard of the Tower of Antonia. It was built into the corner. I didn't mean to talk about this, but just a little bit of the historical setting. It was built into the corner of the temple during this period of time, and it was a garrison for Roman soldiers. And Josephus tells us anytime there, I'm going to tell you a story you're not going to believe in just a minute. Josephus tells us anytime there was a Jewish festival going on, the Roman soldiers would literally come out of the Tower of Antonia and they would stand on the walls of the temple looking down into the temple courts, and they would basically keep the peace. Right. Anytime there's a Jewish festival,
your overlords are keeping an eye on you.
Exactly. During this period of time, this is not something that's going to go unnoticed, and it's gonna have dramatic results. And of course, we see that in the synoptics. My point is, I think we see this in the Gospel of John as well. Now, I know it's a lot so far, and we're just at the beginning of this, but any comments or questions to this point that you got?
So you're saying, like, there, in your estimation, like thinking about what Josephus has written, that the Roman garrison would be stationed around the wall, like this incident, in your estimation, would be likely only to have happened once, partly because of what's textually in there, but partly because, like, socially, the Romans would not have allowed this kind of disruption twice. Like, it would have been, this was a big deal one time. Like,
I think so.
Twice would have been like, this is gonna stop.
Think so. I think they would not have allowed it to happen again. I think they would have taken care of it after the first time, which in fact I think they did. Now, again, there are going to be people who disagree with me, and I'm fine. I can handle that. But I think what's going on here is John is intentionally moving this. So then we have to ask the question: is if he's telling the story up front, I think he's drawing attention to what Jesus is saying about this. Now, I'm going to say this again. I believe, and you guys have heard, we have a whole episode on this. I believe that the Gospel of John is very closely connected historically to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem that happened in AD 70, in 70 AD or AD 70. It's interesting. So I think he's writing soon after the destruction of the temple, and he's answering partly this question: what do we do now that the temple's gone? So if you're writing for a Jewish audience and you're trying to engender faith in Jesus, I think what John is doing is he's showing them this was not only something that Jesus knew, but he was really in some way saying, I am fulfilling the purpose of this temple. Go back to you have here the statement. Well, we'll get to this in a little bit, but there are other places in the Gospel of John where he is essentially saying that Jesus is fulfilling what the temple was about. I've said this to you before. What would you say the temple meant to the people of Israel? What did it?
It was where they could draw near to God.
They drew near to
where
God.
A portion of his presence resided there.
So I would always say it has to do with presence, and it has to do with how they draw near. So the sacrificial system freed them from their sins so that they could, with a clear, pure conscience, draw near to God. And in their understanding, it effectively dealt with their sin. We would, Hebrew writer helps us to think about that a different way. But what I think John is showing us is that Jesus fulfills both those purposes. So John chapter 1, verse 14, the Word became flesh and tabernacled, made his presence tented in our presence. And so he became for us what the temple represents. And then, of course, later on, we have all of this about, how do we get to the Father? Well, the only way to the Father is through me, right, is what Jesus is saying. I am the way now to the Father. If you want to draw near to God, it's through me, is what Jesus is saying. So he fulfills what the temple represents. Okay.
So if Jesus is the temple and he is, let's say this is shortly after AD 70.
Yes.
John, this is for people that already knew the traditional gospel accounts.
Yeah.
They knew who Jesus was. John has written this very specifically. And, if this is about Jesus replacing the temple, how does this I'm going to say the word, that the cleansing or the flipping of the tables, how do you see that fitting in as like being a part of that story, of that messaging?
Read chapter 2, verses 19 through 21. I was going to do this a little bit later, but let's do this now. So this is kind of Jesus' dramatic statement. And in fact, go ahead back to 18, because the Jews here, it refers to Jewish leaders. I don't know what your translation says. Are you using the ESV today? Is that what you're using?
I am.
Okay. Go ahead and read 18 through 21 for me.
Okay. So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body.
So why does John move it here? I would say what the purpose is to make this thesis statement that the temple is now referring to Jesus' body. that Jesus is fulfilling in his body, and we're going to see in his death, burial, and resurrection, fulfilling the purpose for which the temple was there. Forgiveness of sins, the means by which we draw near to God, and the presence of God in the midst of his people. And ultimately we see that in chapter 14, in my opinion, where he says, I'm going to the cross to prepare this place for you.
So the emphasis isn't on the flipping of the tables, but is the flipping of the tables to draw attention to
it's more than that. I think it's more than that. I'll get there. I know. I'm taking a certain.
This is like a slow burn.
I know. Well, you asked.
Give him time. You got to savor it. You got to savor it. This is we're in the book of John. You got to savor it.
So the Jewish leaders here, and the Jews in you and I, there's lots of debate about how to understand this, but I and many others think this is the Jewish leaders come to him and basically says, what authority, why can you do these things? Tell us, give us a sign. And Jesus says, here's my sign, destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. It's we talked about this before. It's a misunderstanding when we talked about the book by Kester, the Symbolism of the Fourth Gospel. It's an example of a misunderstanding because they're thinking he's talking about the physical temple. They show that by saying 46 years we've taken to build this temple, and you're going to do it in 3 days. And John, and here's an example. This is another narrative example. The narrator steps in, looks at the fourth wall, and says he was talking about the temple of his body, and that becomes then the key. That's the thesis statement, I call it, for which we understand then this theme that Jesus is fulfilling what the temple is to represent. And that's why I think that's why John tells it here. Now, here's what we're really getting to. So let's talk about the cleansing of the temple. My primary objection is just simply the use of this title because it's interpretive. Okay. The use of the title is interpretive. In other words, if you call this the cleansing of the temple, you'll never think of it as anything else. You'll think that's what's happening here is a cleansing. Okay.
Like Jesus is just mad and he's just
we've talked about this a little bit. At the simplest level, I think calling it the temple incident leaves the interpretation open. We've talked before about the idea of hermeneutic. What's the word I'm looking for? A horizon.
Perspective. Oh, okay. Horizon.
Okay. And we've talked about in order to come to knowledge, and let's define a couple of terms for our listeners. Hermeneutic is the idea of how we interpret something. It's the process by which we use to interpret something. And epistemology we talked about is how we know something. And these are very important terms. When we talk about that before, and we talk about the use of metaphor as well, what we've talked about is that kind of limits. Metaphor to a certain extent gives us a way to understand something, but it also limits that. Mm-hmm. And cleansing a temple is a metaphor, technically, but it limits then. If we call this cleansing the temple immediately, it's going to limit our horizons. We can't see beyond that horizon if that's the way we're going to think about it. And so my point is the editors of whatever edition of the Bible you're using who've put that as the heading for this section have given us an interpretive framework that we can't get beyond. Yeah,
so you're saying it's almost like it kind of locks in our brain
It
locks us in to see only one thing, and this is the main point of this section, not the temple or
so by calling it the temple incident, I think it leaves that interpretive horizon more open. And it's just an incident. Mm-hmm. However we want to understand that. Now we can understand as cleansing. I'm going to suggest there's another way to understand this. There are two major ways. There probably are others, but there are two major ways most people argue about that this could be understood. One is as a temple cleansing. So let's. I'm going to step back. Let's step away from the Bible for a minute.
Oh, and
let's just talk about the nature of cleansing. Why do you? Well, let me ask you this question first, Ryan. What kind of things do you cleanse?
My body.
Okay. You cleanse your
my
body.
House.
Your what? Your house. Okay.
The house, the dishes,
okay.
My mouth, soap.
Well, that's Okay, let's stop.
I caught you off guard. I caught him off guard. He can't believe I said it.
Let's go back to the
Anyway,
dishes.
go
There's
ahead.
at least one other thing we usually think about when we think about cleansing.
Laundry.
Laundry's the other one, right? So let's talk about dishes there for a minute, and both of those are good examples. Laundry and dishes are good examples. Why do you cleanse the dishes, or why do you we in my household from Southern Indiana we call it washing, but
Washing?
why do you cleanse the dishes?
To remove what has previously been on them, to make them acceptable for the new stomach sacrifice.
Okay. Let's go back to the Bible.
I'm messing him up now.
No. So you're right. I mean, usually when I ask this question, I get one of two things. So the most obvious is what you're saying. Well, they're dirty. Duh.
Right.
You cleanse something when it's dirty. Why do you wash the one shirt that you own that you wear over and over again? Why do you wash it? Well, it's dirty.
Dirty.
But there's another part to it, because that's not the only thing that we could do with something that's dirty. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, why do you clean? Why do you do the laundry?
It's because I want to use it again.
You want to use it again. That's exactly the reason. If you don't ever want to use it again, you don't need to clean it. So let me give you a couple of examples. We talked about dishes, right? If you use paper plates, most of us do not wash the paper plate.
Right.
What do?
Garbage.
We throw it away because it's no longer needed.
Mm-hmm.
It's no longer necessary. It's served its purpose, but it is no longer necessary. And so cleansing, when we call this the cleansing of the temple, it's the same thing. Just like cleansing your shirt. When that shirt finally has enough holes in it, it's falling apart, you can read a newspaper through it. You don't go and wash it one more time. You pick it up and you go, nah, and it goes out in the trash, right?
Right.
Or maybe to Goodwill, I don't know, but you see what I'm saying? You throw it out.
You
get
throw
rid of
it away. Yes.
It no longer has it served its purpose. It had a good purpose. There's nothing wrong with it, but it has outworn that purpose. It's no longer necessary. And then you typically go out and buy a new shirt, or maybe you have another new shirt in your closet already. So that's the only thing I'll say. There's basically two ways we can understand Jesus' actions here. We can either understand him cleansing the temple, getting rid of the problems with the temple so that it can, what would be the implication then? So that proper worship can take place there. And so that can be taking place. The other thing that we can understand is this could be a symbolic destruction. In other words, for a period of time, he's putting a halt to the worship in the temple, and thereby, when he's asked by what authority are you doing these things, his answer is destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. In other words, I will, and the narrator tells us, he talks about his body, that I am going to I'm going to fulfill the true purpose for which this temple has been.
So maybe like a little bit of a foreshadowing of what he's going to do.
I would call it that. And this isn't just me. There basically the two things that people
proleptic.
Well, it could be the two things that people are thinking is and proleptic for 70 AD is what you're saying.
Yeah.
So the two ways people understand this incident is as a cleansing, or the other ways as a symbolic destruction. And I'll give you some examples of both. Let's go back and read the first part of this account. Starting verse 13, okay. It says, when it was almost time, this is chapter 2, verse 13. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. Money changers, we call them. So he made a whip out of the cords, drove all from the temple courts. I think that all is a key there. He drove basically everyone out of the temple. Mm-hmm. And both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers, overturned the tables. To those who sold doves, he said, get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market. So the question we have to ask, and people always use this as an example, and we may talk about this if we have time. Jesus is ticked. Right?
Right.
He's upset.
Angry
here.
Jesus.
And so he says, "Stop turning my father's house into a market." So there are some people who, if you think of this as a cleansing, what he's doing is he's getting rid of the things that are making it unclean, or he's getting rid of these things. So one of the questions we have to ask is, what are these money changers, and what are these people doing with this stuff in the temple? What are these people doing here? Well, money changers, and we've talked about this before, were necessary. It's a necessary part of temple worship, because the coin, the typical coin, denarii, in the day of Jesus, was made by whom?
Rome.
Rome. And what did it have on it?
The emperors.
An image of Caesar. In fact, we see other examples of this. You might remember when Jesus is asked about paying taxes or not, and he
render to Caesar what is Caesar's,
and what has his image. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so the law said you could not take a graven image. The temple was not a place for, and it had to do with idols, right? Mm-hmm. But they took it to the point that you could not pay your temple tax. This, again, is part of the law. Every year you're supposed to pay a temple tax. You could not use the Roman coin. So what the money changers would do is they would take those coins and they would exchange them for they're called temple shekels. And interestingly, and we may link to this in the show notes. Just this last year, there was a little girl that found another one of these, like a little 8-year-old girl or something found one of these, but from the first century. They had images of the menorah on it. They had images of palm leaves and that kind of stuff, but not a human image or an idol, right? And so they would exchange these. Now, some people think that they were cheating them. Look, do you have your Bible there? Look real quick over at Matthew 21, read verses 12 through 13. This is Matthew's account of the temple incident.
Yes. Okay. So you want to read, what do you want me to read again?
Verses 12 and 13 in Matthew 21.
Okay. And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers." And
so some people think that they were either charging an exorbitant amount, or that the money changers were cheating the people, taking a little shaving of the gold so that the temple coins were slightly less valuable than again, if you multiply it over the number of worshipers that would come up to the temple, some people think that
be extraordinary.
Some people think this is what's going on. Some people think that having the cattle in the temple courts was part of the issue, having the animals there for sale, and that the excrement was making the temple unclean. So those are cleansing the temple, if you think that's the case. But here's what I would point out, is they were selling these because when the law was originally written, people had their own flocks and herds. But as Israel became a different kind of nation, where it wasn't strictly agricultural or not strictly nomadic, it was necessary for people to buy animals for sacrifice. So these both the money changers and the people selling the cattle, sheep, and doves were a necessary part of the worship going on there. In other words, people had to use it. Now, the robber makes us think that they were using those positions in order to take advantage of the worshiper. I mean, it's pretty strong. If I'm standing between you and worshiping God, you're going to pay me whatever I ask, right? So it's a pretty strong motive. So that they were misusing this position is a very probable part of this. But when he drives everyone out of the temple, including the animals that were used for sacrifice, and overturning the tables of the money changers for a period of time, for whatever period of time this takes place, Jesus is effectively stopping worship in the temple.
No more sacrifices, because the animals aren't being purchased and brought up for...
And nobody's able to go about their business. And so, again, at least symbolically, he is putting an end to the worship in the temple. Now, here's my point, is I think that fits well with the overall message that the Gospel of John is telling us about who Jesus is and the role that he's fulfilling, especially if I'm correct and others are correct in thinking that the Gospel of John was written soon after the actual destruction of the temple. And if one of the questions that he's answering is, what do we do now that the temple's gone? Well, the answer is, destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. Right.
That Jesus again has taken over. He was kind of a flash forward. The temple's going to be gone. You don't need it anymore. The temple's being rebuilt in me. I am the temple.
I talked about this before, but in John chapter 4, you have this story of the Samaritan woman.
Mm-hmm.
And when she finally realizes he's a prophet, this is starting in verse 19 or so. Here she says, my translation says, "Sir," the word's kurios here, which means Lord. Lord, the woman said, "I can see you are a prophet. Our ancestors," now she's a Samaritan woman.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to actually have an episode about the Samaritans upcoming. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain. This is in the village of Sychar near the Mount Gerizim. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain. There had been a temple there on Mount Gerizim until 128 BC. It was destroyed by a Judean king by the name of John Hyrcanus, one of the Maccabees. Mm-hmm. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem, Mount Zion. Mount Gerizim or Mount Zion? Samaritans believe Mount Gerizim. Jews believe Mount Zion. So what's Jesus' answer? As a Jew, he would probably say, well, Mount Zion.
Jerusalem.
Everybody knows that. That's what the Bible says, right?
Mm-hmm.
Woman, Jesus replied, believe me, a time is coming when you'll worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. Now, remember, John Hyrcanus had destroyed the temple on Mount Gerizim in 128 BC, just 100 and maybe 40, 50 years before this account. And Jesus, I think, prophetically is saying there's a time coming where the temple on Mount Zion is going to be exactly the same as the temple on Mount Gerizim.
Torn down.
Do you see how powerful that would be for someone who's in the aftermath of the Roman destruction of the temple in 70 AD, kind of questioning everything, and has God left us? What's going on here? And I think John's answer, at least, the author of the Gospel of John, is going to say to us, no, God is with us in Jesus, that he is the one, he is the way. He goes on, he says, 22, you Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. These are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. So I'm just using that as another example of the way that this fulfills it. We've talked about in another episode, we talked about John chapter 7, and how Jesus again points to himself in a prophetic statement that there was going to be water in the age to come. Water was going to flow out of the temple in Jerusalem and water all of the land, both summer and winter. And Jesus, at the height of the feast of the festival of Tabernacles, reminds or says to the people, if you're thirsty, come to me and drink, the one believing in me. As Scripture said, from within him,
my heart,
will flow rivers of living water. And so, my koilos, whatever you understand there. So I think it fits well with what John is doing in his presentation of Jesus in the Gospel of John, which is saying Jesus is the temple. And as we've said, as we've talked about ad nauseum in another place, John chapter 14 then is, if John 2 is the thesis statement, John 14 is the conclusion of this theme, to say that Jesus is a fulfillment of what the temple was supposed to do. Let me just show you one other additional thing. This is from the Synoptics, just for fun, and then I'll ask what are the questions you have. It's interesting if we look at Matthew's account of this, because he actually does a similar thing. But what's really fascinating to me about this is if you look at Matthew 26, I'll let you read 59 through 61.
Okay, Matthew 26, 59 through 61.
This is the account of Jesus' trial.
Okay. Yes. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
That's in Matthew, but it's only John that tells us the account when this happened. You see? And again, are we talking about something that happened 3 years or 2 years earlier, or are we talking about something that happened that week publicly?
Probably that week.
And then, well, I don't want to want to interpretively make, put you in a horizon. But look at look at chapter 27 verses 38 through 40 then. This is one of those details we probably have that unless we really dig down and spend some time thinking about this, we might just gloss over.
All right, so 27, 38 through 40?
Yeah.
Okay. Then 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross."
So part of what they're mocking him about, you said you're going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, and now you can't even get down off the cross. Now, ironically, I think they're pointing to exactly what he's talking about, that in 3 days he will, in fact, have defeated death. He will have defeated the cross. One more, look down at verse 51 then of that same chapter.
Okay, 51. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split.
I should have had you read 52. I forgot. But anyway, Jesus cries out with a loud voice and dies. And,
yes.
And at that moment, the curtain of the temple is torn in two. Now, we often interpret that, right, to mean that what he had accomplished, what Jesus accomplished on the cross, now, I have to be careful I say this, but essentially makes the temple obsolete, or the Hebrew writer talks about that his body is that curtain, that we are now able to come into the very presence of God. Whereas in the past, the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies only one day a year on the Day of Atonement, and only him, we now with confidence enter into the Holy of Holies, into the most holy place, right? Through the curtain that is his body. So we often interpret it, and that's from a very early period. The Hebrew writer was already interpreting it this way, that his death is signifying an end to the system as it had been. Right.
Gotcha.
And so I think it's not only John who has this. Now, for John, it is a much bigger theme, I think. But I think this is a part of what early Christians believed and thought about what was happening, what was going on. So my only objection to calling it the cleansing of the temple is it keeps us from possibly. I'm not advocating let's title this the symbolic destruction of the temple, right? I call it the temple incident. I'm just saying let's not title this in a way that
don't pigeonhole it,
right? That it's gonna limit our possible understanding, and so that's what.
And the headers are all from, and the whoever has made that translation, like they put
editors.
It in editors.
At its best, we would think that they would, they probably have a certain amount of scholarship, but if they are the same, it depends on. Are they experts in the Gospel of John, or are they New Testament experts, or are they, translation experts? Who are the editors? And by the way, you can read that in your foreword. It will have a list of the editorial board. But it makes you wonder sometimes, are they up? Have they thought about and studied this particular passage enough to make that kind of a determination?
Yeah, those headers can be they can be somewhat helpful, but also stand in the way.
All I'm saying is just be careful. Don't they are not the Word of God. They are not. They can sometimes. I'm not saying you have to agree with me. I'm saying though, calling it that ahead of time doesn't even open up the possibility that something else could be going on here.
Yeah. Well, that's, I got a reader Bible a couple years ago and I really enjoyed it, because it takes that out. I mean, I've got chapters in there, which again, there weren't chapters in the original Greek or Hebrew either. But it takes some of that stuff out, and it's a reading experience, and the lines are not, and I think that's, that's a different reading experience for me as well. Like books of the Bible that I'd read many times before, then read them in a reader when I'm like, oh, these go together. These sections go together much differently now that I have these breaks out or these headers out of there.
Right.
That I read it all differently.
Let me give you two examples where I think this can be helpful. One, when I'm teaching a shorter epistle, one of the shorter letters, let's say First Peter, often I'll take that, I'll put it in a word processor, and I will take out chapters and verses, and give it to my students. Even sometimes taking the paragraphs out, right, and have them read through the entire letter in one setting. We just don't normally do that, and it's a different kind of experience, as you're saying, than kind of reading. I'm going to read 10 more verses or whatever, and breaking up our reading in that way. And I encourage them to read it in one setting. Most people are surprised how quickly you can read a book of the Bible.
Right.
I always say read large sections of Scripture quickly, study small sections deeply, but just reading through, you can read through pretty quickly, actually. The other example I would give is the Sermon on the Mount. It's interesting. I hadn't thought about this. Just yesterday was an anniversary, 4th anniversary of a student of mine that died tragically in a car wreck. Not a student, a fellow student, when I was at college. But Ken was a great guy, and one of the things he did is he memorized large sections of Scripture. One of the things he did is memorize the Sermon on the Mount, and he would dress himself as Jesus, and he'd come and basically recite the Sermon on the Mount. And I'll tell you, it's again, about 20 minutes is all it takes, but it's very interesting to hear it in that context rather than, again, reading it in Scripture. I'm preaching on the Sermon on the Mount right now. Series makes me think. Every time I'm studying it, I think about when he did that for us. I had him come and do it when I was a dean of a week of church camp, and had him do it for the young people. But you see things in the connections there that you don't when you're going to read this section this week, and you're going to wait and read the next one tomorrow or next week or whenever. There's connections there that sometimes we can make. So again, that when I'm talking about reading the Scripture as narrative, that's what I'm saying. Look for those connections, look for those breaks, hear those repetitions, because it would have been read, orally, or listening, or the orality we call it sometimes, is the way it would have originally been done.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for finally answering.
So does it answer your question? Do you feel good about it now, or are you?
Well, I mean, I feel fine about it. Yeah, no, I feel good about it. I mean, yes. I mean, I understand why you're saying that. It's just, and I think that's an important thing, just to kind of go. And I think this can be not just for the headers, but like if we're bringing some presuppositions to something, are we limiting what we can see from it?
And that's what I'm saying. The way that we interpret, the way that we know things, we need to realize we sometimes are doing that. We're putting a horizon, if you will, on our understanding. So it's necessary. Yeah, it's necessary, but we need to be aware of it. So.
Yeah, and I think it's gonna be hard to break. Yeah. I mean, like some of those things, like when someone talks about Jesus cleanses the temple, it's just like it rolls off the tongue, like oh yeah, I know what that is. I know what that's about. Yeah. So no, I think that's really good, and I'm glad we could finally answer that question about why you scold me when we talk about.
Well, are you going to say it? Here's the question: are you going to say it again, or is it from now on? Are you going to say the temple incident?
I have to have some cognitive reprogramming here, Brian.
All right,
I'm gonna try my best.
Well, I won't call for the invitation hymn then. Well,
I have decided to call it the temple incident. Yes, that's where we're going. All right. Well, thanks, Brian.
All right.
Appreciate it so much. Talk to you
next
soon.
time.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. You can find show notes, links, and more at thebiblebistro.com and find links there to follow us on social media. Next week, Brian and I are welcoming back one of our guests from Season 1, Ryan Burge. As you might recall, in Episode 11, we had a great conversation with Ryan about his book, The Nuns, which discusses the data about those in the United States who would label their spiritual affiliation as nothing in particular. If you haven't heard that episode, I would encourage you to go back and listen. In next week's episode, we are discussing Ryan's new book that will be coming out in March, 20 Myths About Religion and Politics in America. We'll be chatting about some of those myths and what they mean for the church. We hope you will join us for that conversation. Thanks again for listening and sitting with us at the table in the bistro. We'll be back Tuesday.